गोली नहीं चलेगी, समझे?
यस सर।
दुश्मन इस वक्त एक साथ कई चौकियों पर गोलाबारी कर रहा।
In 1964, a film was released that gave us poignant glimpses of a tragic war fought in the cold, barren ranges of the Himalayas. My name is Kavi Pardeep, and today we climb those high mountain passes where buried in the snow lie tales of courage and bravery. It was along those lonely passes that India and China waged a wasted war, where guns had fired in anger in a futile bid to demarcate national boundaries. And glory belonged to those who gave their lives in the service of their nation. October 23rd, 1962. At 16,500 feet, Bumla was already covered in snow. A foot track led down to the important town of Tawang, some 26 kilometers away, 500 meters south of the pass. The D Company of the 1 Sikh Regiment stood guard against a terrible enemy bearing down on India. At 5 that morning, the enemy attacked in great numbers. The first wave was beaten back by the Sikhs. Platoon Commander Subedar Joginder Singh radioed back to company headquarters asking for ammunition as they had almost run out. The Chinese were regrouping for another massive attack. The company headquarters asked Subedar Joginder Singh to fall back, to which he replied that he and his men would not allow the Chinese to get through. When the second wave came, Subedar Joginder Singh of the 1 Sikh Regiment asked his men to fix their bayonets and led them in a hand-to-hand fight to death against the invaders. Joginder Singh fell, grievously injured. He was captured by the Chinese and died in custody. But the time he and his men bought allowed for reinforcements to rush into Bumla and for artillery fire to be directed at the enemy. The Chinese suffered great losses and were unable to breach the wall that D Company had mounted. Subedar Joginder Singh was awarded the Paramveer Chakra for his bravery in the battlefield. Many an act of heroism could not stop the much better equipped and trained Chinese army from overrunning Indian positions. Where a Joginder Singh blocked their path, the Chinese horde bypassed the obstruction like water around a rock. Large chunks of Indian territory were gobbled up as idealistic politics and inferior planning put the entire country at risk. Not many in Delhi had anticipated the implications of a belligerent China awaking from its slumber. The border between India and China crisscrosses the Himalayas from Kashmir in the west to present-day Arunachal Pradesh in the east. And along its 3,488 kilometers lay the seeds of contention that led to an all-out war. In the western sector, the Chinese provinces of Xinjiang and Tibet border Kashmir. India says China has occupied 43,000 square kilometers of Indian territory. This includes the 5,180 square kilometers illegally ceded to them by Pakistan. In the central sector, there's Himachal Pradesh and Uttarakhand on the Indian side, with Tibet on the Chinese side. Shipkila and Karnik are claimed by China in Himachal, as well as Pulam, Parahori, Kungri Bingrila, Lapthal and Sangha in Uttarakhand. In the eastern sector, China claims 90,000 square kilometers of Indian territory, and that includes almost all of Arunachal Pradesh. And it is here that Tawang strategically holds the key to the defense of the entire region.
When we were deployed there, we were not there to fight. We were there to claim the territory that up to this place it is ours. We neither had the proper clothes to sustain ourselves there, nor we had the weapons, nor we had even we had not constructed the fighting bunkers.
3 years earlier, on the 31st of March 1959, a young man dressed in peasant's clothing had crossed the Bumla Pass from Tibet into Arunachal and made his way to Tawang. 8 days before that, and 500 kilometers to the north, the People's Liberation Army of China had marched into his home in Lhasa. 2 months and 6 days short of his 25th birthday, the Dalai Lama of Tibet had not just entered India, he had also begun a life of exile here. Following him, over 90,000 of his supporters crossed the McMahon line that had demarcated land between India and Tibet from British times. Within 3 months of Tenzing Gyatso, the 14th Dalai Lama of Tibet seeking refuge in India, Chinese troops opened fire at Indians on the border.
Skirmishes did take place, but nobody could visualize, even at that time the negotiations were on, so nobody could imagine that the Chinese are going to attack in such massive strength and in places where it suited them and did not suit us.
A small picket near Migyun in eastern Ladakh came under attack and 1 Indian soldier was killed. Another Indian outpost at Longju in northeastern Ladakh was almost run over. And as the days went by, the border skirmishes began to increase in number. Trouble was in the air. In 1947, when the British left India, there was no clear line of control that demarcated the newly independent India and the territory of Xinjiang and Tibet in the western and central sectors. In the official 1950 map of India, Kashmir's boundary east of the Karakoram Pass was shown as boundary undefined. A sort of ambiguity prevailed over large tracts of land. And nothing would have mattered had China remained politically weak and militarily unassertive on its southern boundaries. But in 1949, the Communist Party under Mao Zedong seized power in China and declared the formation of a People's Republic with the avowed objective of awakening China after a century of humiliation. In October 1950, 80,000 soldiers of the People's Liberation Army marched into Tibet and declared it to be part of China. By 1951, the Chinese army was camped in Lhasa, and a treaty was signed which proclaimed that Tibet was a national autonomous region to be ruled by a Chinese commission with the Dalai Lama as a figurehead ruler. Slowly, China began tightening its grip over Tibet, and resistance to its rule began to spread and grow. While all this was unfolding, India found itself in a peculiar situation. It was friends with Tibet, but wanted to be friends with China. Political prudence pointed towards China, yet historical ties supported Tibet. In 1954, India threw in its lot with China with the Panchsheel Agreement. But 2 years later, in 1956, China built a road cutting through Ladakh's Aksai Chin area, connecting Xinjiang and Tibet, making the Aksai Chin area far more accessible to the People's Liberation Army than to the Indian Army. In the eastern sector, NEFA, then the Northeast Frontier Agency, Indian troops began patrolling heights which China saw as a violation of the disputed McMahon Line.
By and large, McMahon Line followed the crest line, which is the principle of a border in mountainous terrain. And Chinese were well aware of that, so were the Indians. There were a few places where there was a difference of perception, So it was not that the whole border was disputed, but unfortunately the Chinese said that McMahon Line is an imperial legacy which has been thrust on them.
By March 1959, the situation in Tibet had turned volatile. On March the 10th, the Chinese opened fire in the streets of Lhasa, and on the 17th, it started firing mortars aimed at the Potala Palace. After hours of indecision, on the suggestion of his advisors, the Dalai Lama fled Lhasa, disguised as an ordinary Tibetan soldier. For the next 13 days, he and a small entourage fled towards India, dodging the Chinese army. When the Dalai Lama crossed over into India, Prime Minister Nehru granted him political asylum. And this may have been the final excuse that China needed to go to war with India. By this time, the Cold War had also made its way into the subcontinent. Prime Minister Nehru was at the forefront of the non-aligned movement, and America kept leaning towards Pakistan. In 1954, the US signed a treaty with Pakistan, and India jumped into an agreement with China. This agreement gave China legitimacy over Tibet, but gave India nothing in return other than, let's say, an ephemeral promise of friendship. This agreement, in true Nehruvian style, was called the Panchsheel Agreement and was valid for 8 years. So this so-called document of friendship came with an expiry date, which was June 1962. On October 20th, 1962, 3 regiments of Chinese troops mounted a blistering attack along the southern bank of the Namkachu River. The Namkachu Valley, situated at the tri-junction of Tibet, Bhutan and India, was militarily a very strategic piece of land. And the Chinese had been prepared for a formidable Indian response. But what the Chinese went up against was a group less than a battalion strong.
We were sitting without any heavy weapons, and Chinese were there with all their weapons, and their ammunition was endless. They came in a strength of 2,007 people across the Thagla Ridge, which we counted, sitting on the other side of Namkachu.
At 5:14 that morning, Chinese mortars began bombarding Indian positions. An infantry battalion crept up behind Indian positions to cut them off entirely. A series of tactical maneuvers across the McMahon Line dislodged the Indian soldiers from their positions. The McMahon Line, drawn by the British, was India's main point of reference and was hotly disputed by China. With an overwhelming position of power, the Chinese marched on to take the rest of Nefa.
Namkachu was a death trap to which Indian army, because of the general's wrong what do we call tactics, strategy, thinking, we just walked into a death trap. It had no significance.
On the 22nd of October, the Chinese attacked Walong along the McMahon Line. After some tough resistance by Indians, China's sheer numbers overwhelmed the Indian position. The following day, the Indian army managed to take an expensive toll on the advancing Chinese army, catching them in a gorge and eliminating 200 troops. But these small gains were swatted aside by the terrifying numbers of Chinese who came, wave after unstoppable wave. Crossing the Bumla Pass, Chinese troops mounted a 3-pronged attack on Tawang. Under-equipped and undermanned, Indian army formations offered little resistance. After occupying Tawang, the Chinese were now in a commanding position over territory that they always claimed to be theirs. While the Chinese army had established a perfect chain of supply, India failed to ration desperately needed reinforcements to stem the tide of the invaders. The Chinese brought in backup formations at regular intervals, turning the war in the eastern sector into a completely one-sided affair. As with every war, there are legends of astonishing bravery. And so it was with this lost war of India. Tales of Indian soldiers who continued to fight even when they knew it would end in their death. The Indian 7th Brigade, a proud formation of legendary fighting units, had been crushed, not because it couldn't fight back, but because of monumental lack of forward planning. The brute force of China's attack showed that India had no credible defense in place. Suddenly, on October 24, the war ceased, and there was little or no fighting for 3 full weeks.
Had we had the intention of fighting, because neither Prime Minister nor the Defence Minister would ever agree that the Chinese will attack India. They thought Chinese will never attack. We can do what we like.
After 4 days of crushing battle, the Chinese Premier, Zhou Enlai, commanded his troops to hold their ground and advance no further. With Indian troops retreating to safer zones, Zhou Enlai used the lull to negotiate with Nehru. He wrote to the Indian Prime Minister proposing 4 things: a negotiated settlement of the boundary, that both sides disengage and withdraw 20 kilometers from present lines of actual control, a Chinese withdrawal in Nefa, and that neither China or India cross their lines of present control in Ladakh's Aksai Chin. Nehru replied that he was interested in peace, but wanted a withdrawal to positions held before the forward deployments that preceded the war. The Chinese Premier simply responded by reiterating his 4-point settlement offer. Politically wounded and angered by the betrayal, Nehru refused to bow. The Indian Parliament declared a national emergency and rapidly passed a resolution to drive out the aggressors from the sacred soil of India. On November the 14th, Nehru told Zhou Enlai there would be no deal. Hours later, the war resumed, both in Nefa and in Ladakh. In the western sector, the situation in Ladakh's Aksai Chin was infinitely worse. Although disputed, it was already almost entirely under Chinese control. The Indian army suffered huge casualties as the Chinese mounted a string of attacks throughout the western sector. But no battle in this most inhospitable of war zones has ever matched the Indian defense of the strategic ridge at Rezang. The 13th Kamau Regiment's Charlie Company had been tasked with defending the approach to a valley that held a strategic airstrip. At an altitude of 16,000 feet, in cold and snow, with the wind howling through the heights, Major Shaitan Singh and his men fought back a massive assault by Chinese forces.
यही एक ऐसा पोस्ट था लद्दाख जो हिंदुस्तान ने मार नहीं खाई.
The Indian soldiers were doomed from the start, without artillery support and facing barrage after barrage of heavy Chinese guns. Major Shaitan's unit battled fiercely, doing everything it possibly could to hold on to their ground.
कोई ऐसा राउंड नहीं था, नदी खाए तब. अब जिससे मेरी गोली से आदमी वैसे चली गई होगी. मैंने तो ऐसे जो आदमी आ रहे हैं ना, यूं तो ऐसे से फायर किए हैं LMG से.
In these freezing temperatures, the young officer fought the battle of his life. Seriously wounded and bleeding, he continued to fight and raised the morale of his battered unit. But nothing could stop the advancing Chinese, who brought the brute force of a full artillery unit against the floundering positions held by Major Shaitan's soldiers.
हमारे जवान के किसी के पीठ में गोली नहीं लगी, एकदम आगे से गोली लगी हुई जिसके भी लगी हुई हैं। और ये मिसाल है 13 कुमाऊं का जवान के कोई पीठ में गोली नहीं लगी।
Till his last breath, Major Shaitan Singh remained in battle position, hand on the trigger of his weapon. Rezang was overthrown, but not without a massive expense to the far more powerful Chinese. Estimates say that as many as 500 to 1,000 Chinese troops were felled by the brave Charlie Company of the 13th Kamau Regiment. 114 of the 123 Indian soldiers perished in the onslaught. The Chinese acknowledged they had suffered their greatest casualties at Rezang. When Major Shaitan Singh was posthumously awarded the Paramveer Chakra, his citation read, "For every man lost to us, the enemy lost 4 or 5. On 18th November, the Chinese overran Bomdi, the southernmost strategic point that they were to occupy. The road to the plains of Assam lay open before them, when suddenly they declared a unilateral ceasefire along the entire border and announced withdrawal of its troops to 20 kilometers behind the actual line of control. The war was over, but it had effectively broken Nehru. His health steadily declined, and he died 2 years later, broken-hearted by a betrayal that he never got over. We end this episode of Guns and Glory with the iconic song of patriotism that brought tears to Nehru's eyes. A song that Lata Mangeshkar sang in memory of all those who fell in the War of 62.
संगीन पे धर कर माथा सो